Okay, you've probably heard this story. The night before Halloween, 1938, a radio broadcast comes on the air and it convinces all of America that Martians are invading, sparking this massive nationwide panic. It's one of the most famous tales in media history, right? But what if the story we all think we know isn't the real story at all? Let's dig in.
I mean, just listen to that. That's supposed to be a reporter live on the scene watching a Martian heat ray just incinerate a crowd of people in New Jersey. That's the kind of thing that would send a shiver down your spine. And you can imagine, for some folks listening that night, it felt terrifyingly real.
So the legend goes something like this. Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air put on this adaptation of H.G. Wells's classic novel. And they did such an amazing job, their radio magic was so convincing that hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, of Americans completely fell for it.
But what if that version of events, the one that's been repeated in textbooks and documentaries for decades, is actually the biggest myth of them all?
Okay, so to really understand the myth, you have to appreciate the pure genius of the broadcast itself. Welles and his crew didn't just, read a story. No, they staged a full-on media event. They reworked the novel to sound like a series of urgent breaking news bulletins that were interrupting a totally normal evening of music.
And the formula they used was brilliant. Seriously. They'd start with some boring dance music, then a bulletin would cut in about some weird explosions on Mars. Then they'd have this calm, authoritative expert interview with a professor from Princeton. It was all designed to gently pull you in, to make you feel like this was real, before they hit you with the chaos from the crash site in Grover's Mill. It completely blurred the line between entertainment and news, especially if you missed the disclaimer at the very beginning of the show.
And the story we're told is that the effect was just immediate and overwhelming. People were packing up their cars and hitting the road. Police stations, newspaper offices, their phone lines were completely jammed with panicked calls. There were even reports of miscarriages and people being treated for shock. It was painted as mass hysteria on a scale nobody had ever seen.
This is the question that starts to unlock the whole mystery. Because what if the panic itself wasn't even the main event? What if the real main event was the story about the panic? And more importantly, the very powerful reasons people had for telling it that way.
And that brings us to our first major twist. This idea that the legendary nationwide panic wasn't a real thing at all, that it was a story that was deliberately cooked up and sensationalized by a rival industry.
Just look at this number. 2%. It's kind of staggering, right? According to the Hooper radio ratings, which were the industry standard back then, only 2% of the entire radio audience was even listening to Orson Welles that night. Almost everyone else was tuned into the country's most popular show, the Chase and Sanborn Hour. So let that sink in. The audience for this supposed nationwide panic was actually incredibly small.
So why did this story get so huge? Well, to get that, you got to understand what the media world looked like in the 1930s. Newspapers were in deep trouble. The Great Depression had crushed their advertising money, and now this hot new thing, radio, was stealing both their readers and their advertisers. For the newspapers, radio wasn't just competition, it was an existential threat.
And right here, this is basically the smoking gun. The newspaper industry's own trade journal was openly calling out radio's credibility. So for them, the War of the Worlds broadcast wasn't some terrible crisis. No, it was a golden opportunity. This was their chance to paint radio as a dangerous, irresponsible, and untrustworthy place to get your information.
I mean, the irony is just off the charts. You had newspapers writing these screaming headlines about radio's blood-curdling fiction, while they themselves were using wildly exaggerated, sensationalized, and often totally fact-free reporting to make their point. They basically invented the panic they were pretending to report on. Okay, so that's the next big question, right? Because a smear campaign by newspapers is one thing, but for a myth like this to become accepted as historical fact, it usually needs something more. It needs a stamp of academic approval. And that takes us to the deepest and honestly the most fascinating part of this whole story.
So it turns out the reason this myth stuck around has a lot to do with the academic world. The whole panic idea was basically cemented in our collective memory thanks to a huge study from Princeton University, a study that, when you look closer, is full of some pretty amazing contradictions.
This is the book right here, The Invasion from Mars, led by a psychologist named Hadley Cantrell. It was a really groundbreaking piece of research on mass communication, and it became the go-to source for pretty much every historical account of the broadcast that came after it. And its big conclusion? That this broadcast proved the immense, terrifying power of radio to create mass hysteria. But here's the crazy part. The study kind of had two different phases. You see, to get the funding for the project from the Rockefeller Foundation, Cantrell pitched it as the mass hysteria study, playing up the idea of a huge national panic. But the actual data, the stuff his team collected, told a totally different story. It found that the media's effects were actually pretty weak, and that whether or not someone panicked had way more to do with things like their education and critical thinking skills. The dramatic sales pitch just didn't match the complicated reality of the findings.
So who were the researchers who actually found this more nuanced reality? Well, when we peel back this final layer, we find the largely forgotten figures who did the real heavy lifting behind the whole study.
Probably the most important idea to come out of the entire study was this concept called checking up. It was developed by a brilliant researcher named Herta Herzog, and she wasn't so much fascinated by the panic, but by the exact opposite. Why did so many people not panic? What made some people decide to check other stations, or look out the window, or call a neighbor to verify? That was the real, groundbreaking question.
But Herta Herzog, along with her colleague Hazel Goddett, were barely even recognized for their work. While the male academics, Hadley Cantrell and Paul Lazarsfeld, were busy fighting over who would be the lead author and chasing funding, the two women who actually conducted the interviews, analyzed the data, and came up with the core concepts, they were given a tiny, with the assistance of, credit. Their more complicated findings were basically buried in favor of the much more dramatic and more fundable story of mass hysteria.
So, when you put it all together, how on earth did a small, pretty exaggerated event become this unshakable national myth?
Well, it was basically a perfect storm. First off, it's just a fantastic story. You've got aliens, panic, a boy genius director, the whole shebang. Second, it works as this powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of new media. Third, the newspaper industry had a huge financial reason to blow this story way out of proportion. And finally, a prestigious university study came along and gave the whole myth a stamp of legitimacy, all while the more complex truth and the women who uncovered it were pushed to the side in the name of funding and fame.
You see, the story of War of the Worlds isn't really about something that happened in 1938. It's a timeless lesson in how stories get made, how myths get built, and how the narratives we accept as absolute fact are so often shaped by forces we never see. Things like business rivalries, academic politics, and just the simple human need for a good, dramatic story. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?